All right, so Andreas is traveling today. So on behalf of Andreas and the IMC, it's my big pleasure to introduce Kristian and Cordula for today's talk. Kristian and Cordula are associate professors at the IMC and the Aarhus University, the department there. And of course, two of the most clever and creative people around. So it's our big pleasure, and we look forward to today's talk on virtual reality and cultural evolution. So please take it away.
Thank you, Kristian. Can I suggest myself as the one who introduces you the next time? Well, thank you, all of you, for joining this morning. So we're going to present some, I was going to say ongoing work, but we're at the stage where we are kind of trying to complete the analysis, and it's a good time to get a little bit of feedback on this project. It's a project that we have developed together with Sarah, who's also among us this morning. Sarah was a guest student from the Tabriz Islamic Art University in Iran and spent 9 months together with us here at the IMC in Aarhus. And we developed this project together with her. She has a background in urban design and architecture, and we are, of course, I'm preoccupied with studies of language and language evolution, and Cordula is very interested in affordances and perception action and social interaction. So this is, you would recognize that this project kind of brings together all these kind of different perspectives. But let's start by zooming out a bit. So I just need to activate this window here. So we are going to kind of tap a bit into a long-standing debate concerning the nature of concepts, and there are kind of various big suggestions around in the literature. One being that concepts have some kind of existence independent of human cognition and the human mind. So Frege and Peirce and others have suggested that for instance, when we try to draw a circle, everyone will recognize that we are attempting to produce something that is actually an object that is kind of has some kind of ideal transcendental existence in some kind of Platonic realm. But we can, of course, only hope to approach the ideal meaning of a circle, and that was kind of, I think there are also some examples from logic, and that has kind of been generalized as a theory of meaning, that meaning has some kind of ideal core that is independent of human cognition. Another suggestion is extreme biologism, suggesting that concepts should have some kind of innate core, that the mind is, that we are kind of born with some core concepts at least, which makes, of course, the concept of human meaning very dependent on human biology. And lastly, and I guess this is, where we would find ourselves, is the idea that human meaning and human concepts are experiential in nature, that they are somehow related to our experience of the world, and that these experiences, that they come with some structure already from the world, but actually what happens is that in some kind of community of people interacting together, we kind of negotiate how exactly we construe the world. So sometimes the world actually allow for different types of construal or different conceptualizations, and different communities of speakers interacting with each other will kind of negotiate and agree upon ways to approach the world or to conceptualize the world. Now, notice that the first two suggestions here, they actually come with some assumption of universality, right? So if meanings exist perfectly independent on any aspect of human cognition or interaction, or if they are deeply hardwired into our genes, then we should supposedly meanings should be universal, right? We should experience that people experience the world in the same exact way all around the globe. However, the embodiment theory comes with this idea that actually, since meanings have an element of social constitution, that we kind of can agree about how we want to construe the world, it comes also with the possibility that there could be variability in how we experience the world. This has kind of become a theme, and this very programmatic article came out some years ago in 2009, where Nick Evans and Stephen Livingston actually suggest that this should be the huge project for cognitive science to kind of map out linguistic diversity rather than trying to search for universals. So that they suggest that diversity is actually the most characteristic trait of human language. Like if you look at the way other species communicate, their communication systems are within species much more similar than human language. So they suggest that we should actually go and study diversity, study the sources of diversity, because that's the kind of next topic then. So where does all that diversity come from then? What are the sources of it? Is that perfectly stochastic, or is there some kind of structure to the variability? And there's actually, especially in the language sciences, some suggested quite recent developments, right, where people have started searching for correlations between certain kind of, you could call them environmental factors, and linguistic structure, or structure in the way that we conceptualize the world and how it's expressed linguistically. So for instance, in the citation here from Dale and Lupin, they actually suggest that there could be some demographic or social factors that seem to have an effect on how languages develop, and that could be one source of linguistic variability. And environmental factors pertaining to climate, or to the amount of sunlight and stuff like that, actually seem to find its way all the way down in linguistic structure. We are particularly interested in space, and there some interesting work have been done in looking at frames of reference, so the way in which we conceptualize space and the kind of diversity there. So if we were in English or in Danish to describe this small scene that I put up here, we could use an intrinsic frame of reference and say that the pony is in front of the fan. We could also use a relative frame of reference and say that the pony is left of the fan, or we could use an absolute frame of reference and say that the pony is north of the fan. However, it so happens that some languages of the world, they don't have the first two options here, the intrinsic and the relative. They only use the absolute, which is kind of interesting, because that seems to also have an impact on how they solve non-linguistic tasks. So this is not just kind of a surface linguistic phenomenon. It actually has something to do with the way that they perceive the world, or construe the world conceptually, also in non-linguistic context. And has been shown in some interesting studies. For instance, in a study comparing people speaking Dutch, they would also have tend to kind of favor the intrinsic and the relative frame of reference, and people who speak Tzotzil, a language from a region of Mexico, where they actually only have the absolute frame of reference. They came into the lab and they were shown this kind of scene here, and then they were rotated 180 degrees and asked to reproduce that scene. And notice that if you are kind of inclined to construct this scenario from an egocentric perspective and thinking about this as a kind of an intrinsic relation, then you would tend to reproduce this scenario in this particular fashion. However, if you construe this, the big circle here to be, let's say, west of the small one, then you would tend to reproduce this scenario. And that was actually what they found, that the Dutch-speaking people, they would systematically tend to reproduce this scenario, while the Tzal speaking participants would produce the absolute solution here, which is kind of interesting. Now, one kind of small comment in the article reporting this study is that, okay, it might be that there are certain environments that just present this absolute solution as a very kind of favorable one. So if you are in a rural environment where you always kind of have huge landmarks suggesting where your absolute coordinates north, east, south, west are, maybe you're more likely then to end up construing like these spatial relations relying on this absolute scheme. While if you're, let's say, in an urban environment where you might not even be able to locate the sun all the time, then you might be more inclined to or be more attracted to the intrinsic or relative. So we could imagine a situation where we would have some kind of bias in the environment, that the environment simply present a stronger affordance for one conceptualization than another one. You would say the environment invites a particular conceptualization, and that's kind of reflected then in language. And the moment that it's picked up in language, I guess we have this kind of enhancement going on, because then in order to use language in the appropriate way in your speech community, you will automatically selectively come to direct attention to those particular cues that are encoded in language. So we have this kind of initial bias presented by the environment that will be kind of reinforced the moment that it is kind of encoded in language. And we could imagine that eventually it's conventionalized. And what happens typically when things conventionalize is that then the kind of linguistic practice become its own attractor, attracting in its own right, and it might actually eventually override the environmental bias. So the moment something conventionalized, we might even imagine that people would stick to this particular practice, even kind of if they actually go and stay in another environment. This, I think, Nick Fay, who is present with us today, have done work on the extent to which we stick or we shift our conceptualizations. We actually did look into this in a previous study with Jonas Nölle, who is also among us this morning. Here we looked at how people conceptualize a very empowered kind of environment. So we picked up a paradigm that has been used before, called the maze game, and that is a task where people have to negotiate how to refer to certain spatial positions. So there are two people, they have to help each other get through a maze, and they can only do that by going to some switches and opening some gates. And that require them to figure out a good way to point to positions in the maze. So for instance, I think here's a switch as far as, oh, maybe this isn't the switch actually. But how do I tell Cordula to go there because she cannot see this color? I would have to find a good explanation somehow and say, oh, do you see maybe that there's some kind of, that the upper part of the left upper part kind of constitute a square, and the lower right corner of that square, that's where you find your switch. That could be kind of one way to talk about this. However, it was found that while participants would often start giving instructions like these, they would tend to gravitate towards a more abstract scheme that would, where they would kind of discover that they could refer to this as a coordinate scheme. So we could say, oh, that was a little fast, that actually you should go to 4.3 or something like that, and that would be super effective. And when the next maze comes up, I can kind of reuse that scheme and so on and so forth. So that has kind of been replicated through several studies, that people start up thinking about these mazes in a particular, construing them conceptually in a particular way as a figure, but would be attracted then to a more abstract way of conceptualizing this small environment. What we then did with Jonas Nölle was to play around with different environments. So we would kind of parachute people down in environments that actually came with different affordances. So some people would solve the game in these kind of very irregular mazes. Some would have mazes that would have this kind of propensity to be stratified in horizontal lines, and then we would have these a condition where people would do it in very the task in very regular mazes, and with the prediction that it might be that people would kind of capitalize on those particular affordances provided by the environment, which in this case is this kind of very simple thing. And actually we found we published this study earlier this year, and we found that when you are presented with these very irregular mazes, then you are much more likely to actually talk about positions using these kind of figural strategies, saying that, oh, I'm in the sticking up part and towards the upper right corner or something like that. If you are in these kind of mazes consisting of lines, then actually you would construe the space as consisting of lines. So you talk about we can see that people would be very attracted to a line strategy over time and so on and so forth. Yes, let's move on. Now I'll hand over the keyboard to Cordula. Yeah.
Right, so Kristian introduced this really strong link between environment, language, conceptualization of space, and also other aspects. Before we move to the present study that I'll introduce, I just want to give one more example that also adds the dimension of culture, if you want. So what we're talking about in this particular study is how environmental biases are also transmitted throughout generations in a transmission chain. And this is also interesting because it's a non-verbal task. So now just an example from a non-linguistic task. In this project, which is still under review, but we have a preprint somewhere, we were interested in the environmental constraints on action performance and how these would be transmitted and kind of stabilized to something when going from one participant to the next. This was a music task, so what participants' job was in this experiment was to play drums. And as you can see over here on the left, you have we have arranged these 3 drums in specific spatial format. So, and we introduced participants to the task of just drumming these 3 pads in a specific order. And what we varied, and this was the particular environmental constraint on the task, is basically the order in which the drums should be played. And I have these drawings here, which suggest that in one condition, participants were just to move in small steps from one to the next one, or down here in the large, they were just going from the one outer one to the other one, back and forth. Which the interesting parts were the drums that's here in the middle, where you would actually change from making larger movements and to smaller movements. So you would kind of have a large movement and then going in a different order back using the smaller movements. So this was interesting because we introduced participants to a seed rhythm. That is, we gave the very first participant in a longer chain of participants a very regular metronome beat of 500 milliseconds. So all they would be hearing was dum, 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 dum. And they were asked to reproduce this on the drum pads. And as you can imagine, making a movement from a larger movement normally takes more time. So this is something intrinsic to action performance compared to the smaller ones. So what we were interested in is whether these kind of constraints on action would lead to different rhythms over time. And I'm not going to go super deep into the results, but just with this graph, what we show here is how over generations, so each column is a generation. So we started here on the left with someone getting this very regular beat. And over time, so the output of one participant's movements would then be come as input, as the next input for the next participant. What we can see is that for the very regular movements, people were actually quite good in sticking to the rhythm. What you have plotted here is the distribution of onset intervals, which basically translates to how regular is the beat. And you can see up here where the small movements were done, and also down here where the large movements were done, people were relatively regular. In the middle ones, however, you see that in the beginning, the first generation was kind of regular still. But over time, so going from one generation to the next, what you can see is that the distribution becomes bimodal. So we have some more slow and some faster movements. And these, as we can see in this graph that zooms into the last generation, just for these large, small, small, or small, small, large movements, these really reflect something about the movement performance, right? Really about what is it in the action that biases you towards changing the rhythm. But the key point here is that we see this only slowly taking place over generations. So there's something about transmitting information from one person to the next, some kind of amplification of a bias that already seems to exist in the first generation, but really becomes strong when you have this cultural or this transmission aspect. So when we take all of this previous research together, we can now zoom in what the current study was meant to be with. And Kristian already mentioned that Sarah, our co-author, comes from the background in urban design. So we really wanted to understand better how environments and specific urban environments kind of provide biases and how we can bring this together with this idea of language and cultural transmission. So our background for the study was to say that people live in very different urban environments. If you just look at how different cities look like and villages, this really shows you something about the scope of human habitats. So these different urban environments kind of may provide some cues that also influence how you navigate through them. So just because they are so different, and we've seen that differences in the layout of tasks may influence how you talk about it, how you think about it. So these different salient cues for spatial navigation might then be reflected in how people express this. So what we will show you in a bit is we used route descriptions in our task. So people had to write down verbally how they would navigate through a particular environment. And we also asked them to draw maps of the environment in which they had been in. So our idea was that maybe something in the specifics of the environment would be reflected in how people then report about it. And putting this extra layer to it, maybe there's already some bias that we can measure in individuals, but is there something that kind of gets enhanced and strengthened through the social transmission? Can we kind of in the lab establish a certain form of culture? And the idea here would be that this social transmission enhances the, or kind of directs attention more strongly. So if I'm going to read something or that Kristian has written for me, then some biases that Kristian has observed in his environment, which he wrote down, will already draw my attention to specific features of the environment. And through this, we predicted some kind of enhancement. And finally, the idea was that these might then become conventionalized, so that these cultural cues through the written text might eventually even kind of overrule, at least influence the environmental cues. So if we look at this graph again, we can now bring it to the level of our experiment, where we try to bring all these different components into the lab in some way. So the environment we manipulated, we'll show you the details in a bit, but basically we provided different types of environment to participants. And based on these different environments, we wanted to see how the language changes on it. So we kind of measured how the language and also map drawings would be influenced by the environment and would therefore tell us something about how people conceptualize their environment. And finally, we addressed this conventionalization and maybe culture with it by having a temporal structure to it through cultural transmission. All right, so here is our task. As our title suggests, we had a virtual reality experiment. So we created multiple different environments, which we can classify in two different types. One is an environment that we call the Manhattan condition, which was characterized by very straight perpendicular streets, and kind of the building color and texture was not very salient, so it was a little bit desaturated. And this is what you can see in the upper graph. This left side is basically what participants saw when they were in the VR, and I have a little video that can show this in a second. But just to introduce the other condition, which we called Barcelona condition, which was characterized by winded streets and very bright saturated colors on the building and texture. So hopefully the difference is clear here. And just to show you that the terms also make, or the names make sense, here's just some images from Google Maps showing a view on Manhattan and showing a view on Barcelona, and there's something in it. So I mean, what these pictures basically show is just there is really something very different in different types of urban designs. And we try to capture certain aspects of that. Maybe
as a side note, what the particular strength of VR in this condition, or in this context, is then that we can hold everything else constant, right? So we could have the same streets, the same squares, the same buildings. So we only introduce like some very controlled manipulations, like the ones that Cordula explained.
That is true, because it would of course also be nice to just walk through Manhattan and Barcelona, but then we have a lot of uncontrolled factors. So the idea is really to bring it to the lab and manipulate just certain features where we have predictions about. The red line in the background, which is basically where our little city ended. But in the city, you had multiple of these streets. The environment here is Manhattan. So you see the colors don't stand in the foreground very much, but you have these very rectangular street that tells something about the environment. So based on our two environments, we hypothesized that these would afford different conceptualizations, which would then be expressed differently in route descriptions. And specifically, we expected that in the Manhattan condition, people would mainly reference these horizontal structures and their properties. And with that, we mean the streets, the intersections, certain squares, maybe counting them. So these would all be kind of reflecting the structure of Manhattan. In the Barcelona condition, on the other hand, we expected that people would make more reference to vertical structures and their properties. So something about how the buildings look like, the features of the wall, the texture, the color, something about blocks in the design. As a second hypothesis, so this would be the influence of environment, and the second hypothesis generation. So here's our design. Them with the VR first. We then asked them to find a target object, which was a small flower. You see it on the slides there. After they had found the flower and went out of the VR again, we asked them to write down instructions that would then help the next participant to find the object. And in the end, we also asked them to draw a map. So here's just a sketch of this. On the axis, you have our generations. So the very first generation, the first participant in the chain would start with finding the target, then write down instructions that participant 1 has written, and we give it to a second participant. They don't interact, they are not in the room at the same time, it's a new participant coming to the lab. This new participant would read the instructions from participant 1, go into the same environment and try to locate the target that participant 1 has found using these verbal instructions. After this has been completed, we ask this participant to go in a second time and find a new target that would be located in a different place in the environment. And again, we would then ask, write instructions for another participant and also draw a map of this. And so on. These new instructions would then be given to the next participant who would find the same target, go in a second time, find a new target, and so on. And we had 6 of these participants in one chain. So overall, our design looked like this. We had these chains with 6 generations, and we had 2 conditions. People would either be doing this task in Barcelona, or they would be doing that in Manhattan. And we had 6 chains in each. All right, so much about the task. Now, what did we do? Our main focus in the analysis was on the verbal descriptions that people produced in order to help another participant find the targets. And we coded these words by sorting them in certain categories. So these are our categories. So we differentiated color, texture words that are related to the patterns on the side of the walls, number words that would tell something about the order of streets, for example. So go to the second street and then turn left. These and then all kinds of vertical landmarks referring to buildings, walls, houses, arch, and so on. And a different category would be these horizontal landmarks that looked at the map of the street. So for example, intersection, square, and so on. And then we aggregated them and had 2 summary conceptualizations, which we called the vertical and the horizontal one. So the vertical relates to all these categories, so color, texture, and vertical landmarks, bringing them together, all the words that relate somehow to this vertical dimension, and the other one, the horizontal, to all kinds of numbers and horizontal landmarks. And after we had done this, after we had kind of decided how, or after we had sorted the words, we had an automatic search algorithm through all the texts that were produced, and this is what the analysis is based on. Right. We also coded the maps that people produced. Please note that the maps were never given to another participant, right? So these were was just additional information for us to see or to learn more about the conceptualization of space by participants. So we also had independent coders kind of describe the maps to us based on certain variables. We also had further control variables in the task, which was, for example, how long participants needed to actually locate the target, which could give us some information about how useful a description was. And we also asked participants to complete a mental rotation task at the end of the experiment. But our focus here for today is really on the verbal descriptions. Yes.
Yes, so let's jump to some results. As indicated by this graph here, we actually do find some interesting interaction between our conditions. So here we have the Barcelona and the Manhattan condition, and we have the proportion of these keywords. And what we look at first is these aggregated categories that kind of summarize vertical and horizontal structures. And what we see is that in Barcelona, as we progress through the generations, participants were more likely in their descriptions to refer to vertical structures and color and texture, right? These things that we kind of lump together as being a particular kind of way of construing the city spaces here, right? While they are less likely to use these horizontal, or to construe the space with respect to the horizontal structures. And we see a main effect also here in the Manhattan condition. The generation effect is a little more subtle, you could say. But if we break it up, we do notice, for instance, that here in the Barcelona condition, like the first generation would not be super likely to use color, but then as these root descriptions are passed on from generation to generation, we see that we have this enhancement. People get more and more inclined to use color in their descriptions, right? And the same goes for vertical landmarks, for instance, while we see that horizontal landmarks go down here in the Barcelona condition. And in the Manhattan condition, we do see actually numbers go up here. So counting, saying, go to the 3rd street on the left and then turn there and then go forth 2 streets, and then you would, like that's something that seemed to be particular for the Manhattan condition. And this is a little bit of a messy graph, so we can also look at it by just grouping them a little bit differently. And here we see that color, for instance, seems to be propagating in the Barcelona condition, but less so in the Manhattan condition, while, for instance, something like number seems to propagate in the Manhattan condition, less so in the Barcelona condition, and so on and so forth. This is the verbal descriptions. If we look at the maps, we get a similar picture. This actually looks like a perfect double dissociation, right? So we have, again, these were coded with respect to the same categories, and we see that the horizontal structures, or the way of construing the space with respect to horizontal structures is kind of declining here in Barcelona and going up in Manhattan. And we can see, for instance, something like texture here seems that participants are much more likely to refer to textures in their map drawings by the 6th generation in the Barcelona condition, but less so. It actually goes a little bit down here in the Manhattan condition. Again, we can kind of group them differently. Now the pattern looks very clear here, but in fact we did not get very strong results for the generation manipulation here, because there is some variability. But also notice that maps were not passed on. It was only the verbal description that were passed on between generations. So it's actually quite nice that we see these kind of patterns here. So then we did actually not have any very particular predictions concerning something like the performance of these descriptions. But since we did record how long it took people to find their target when they kind of receive an instruction, we could actually look at the relationship between the conceptualization as expressed in the description and how fast participants were in finding the target based on those description. And there we see actually a beautiful pattern here. So if you're in the Barcelona condition, then the more the description you get is relying on the kind of vertical conceptualization, the faster or the easier it is for you to go and actually find the object. While the more that it's based on horizontal, that is a conceptualization that you would say do not really maybe meet the affordances of that environment, the longer it takes participants to go and find the object. And we have something similar here in the Manhattan, or actually we have the opposite pattern in the Manhattan as you would predict. And actually, so this is a 4-way interaction. So we don't really have the power to do the big model, but if we break it up into three-way interactions, we actually do get significant results for this, which is quite interesting, because that was not something that we had actually hoped for. But it shows that the extent to which your description meets the affordances of the environment, your recipient will have an easier time going and finding the object. Now, let's just have a brief summary then. So in the Barcelona conditions, we do see that participants refer more to particular cues, such as the vertical structures, buildings, and their colors and textures. And in the Manhattan condition, people are more likely to refer to horizontal structures, such as the street and their intersections and their numbers and so on and so forth. We also do see an effect of cultural transmission. So these initial biases that we observe, they seem to be enhanced over through cultural transmission over time, so that by generation 6 they are stronger than by generation 1. We do see also that this is not just like a surface linguistic phenomenon. It's not just a product of linguistic priming or something like that, because it's replicated when people draw the maps. So it seems to be actually something that we would argue relates more to the underlying conceptualization of the space. And then we do see this, that there's a relationship between conceptualization and performance in terms of how effective the descriptions are. So if a description kind of meet the affordances of the environment, then your recipient have an easier time going and finding the target. Now, let's complexify this a little bit. So far, these are kind of our main findings. We regard this our main findings, but we also kind of mentioned that sometimes we can have a situation where things conventionalize to an extent where they become the kind of social layer that we built on top of the environment here become the stronger attractor. And we were wondering how we could kind of try to tap into that. So let's imagine a situation where by generation 5 or 6, we have kind of established a particular way of, in our little speech community, to construe the space. What happens then if our participant now goes and visits a different space? If the participant who is, let's say, brought up in Barcelona goes and visits Manhattan, right? What happens then? And a prediction could be that the further we are in the generation chain here, the more entrenched will the particular conceptualization be. And that means that the more likely our participant will be to generalize from their, you could say, native environment to this other environment. So when they go and spend time there, we try to add that to our experimental design by having participants actually doing an extra trial. So after they performed their trial in their main condition, they were presented with a target, the task of finding a target in the other condition. So if they were in the Manhattan as in the outset, then by the end of the experiment, we gave them an extra trial in the Barcelona and the other way around. That means that actually what looked like a very complicated design a moment ago was more complicated, because we actually presented every participant with an extra little task here of finding a target in the opposite or the other environment, right? That means if you were in the Manhattan, you would go in here. After you have completed your task, you would go into the Barcelona and you would write an instruction and draw a map there also. Hope this is clear.
But just so important is that these were then never transmitted, right? I mean, that's, So these other instructions were just for us to learn about conceptualization. Yeah,
so the instructions that you would write for where the target was located in the other condition here was not passed on. But we still look at them in order to figure out whether the kind of priming from your native environment here would have an effect of how you were actually encountering another environment, and if that would change as a function of generation. let's look at, yeah.
Can I ask a question? So the first results you presented was between groups or between subjects design. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. And did you introduce these conditions to the participants as Barcelona and Manhattan, or was it just A and B?
No, this is something that we these are labels that we use internally. Yeah.
Okay.
For clarifying the differences.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. So let's have a sneak peek here at the results, and importantly now, so this is a little bit complicated, right? So Barcelona here actually means that your native environment is Manhattan, but now you go and visit Barcelona. And what happens here over time is that that we can see that you are actually more likely. So actually, if we start looking over here, because this is perhaps the plot that follows our predictions in some sense, and we can look at that afterwards. So if you're kind of brought up in Barcelona and then you visit Manhattan, then initially you're quite likely to reproduce the pattern of your that is afforded by the environment itself. So even if you are kind of brought up in Barcelona, then in generation 1, if you go into Manhattan, you would tend to look for cues that reflect a horizontal conceptualization of the space. But as we go through generations and the conceptualization becomes more entrenched through transmission, we see that by the end here, actually, even if you're in the, if you're in the Manhattan condition, you would actually tend to conceptualize the space using the vertical terms, that is, vertical structures, their textures and their colors, and so on and so forth. This could suggest that as these things are kind of conventionalizing in Barcelona, you are more likely to generalize them even when you visit another environment, so they become kind of strong here. One reason to be a little doubtful of that is that we actually see the same exact pattern here, so we don't get the double dissociation we had hoped for. So also, if you come from Manhattan and you enter Barcelona, we see actually more emphasis over generation of the vertical structure. So we don't get any kind of very clear suggestion here that you generalize the native pattern more so by generation 6 than generation 1. Here's some here, if we break it up a little bit, we see some suggestion here that, for instance, in generation 1, if you come from Barcelona, you enter Manhattan, you are likely to use numbers, but less so if you are in generation 6, that is, then you bring with you already the kind of biases to look for color and so on and so forth. If we look at the maps, oh, these were the maps. Sorry. So we get we get this actually maybe a slightly clearer picture here from the maps this time around. Again, if you come from Barcelona, you enter in the last trial into Manhattan, then we see that initially you are more likely to use horizontal or to construe the space in a horizontal way, and then over generation we see you bring in this kind of conceptualization from Barcelona, and here we do have a kind of weak indication of an opposite pattern. And again here, yeah, we see that numbers go up here and go down here. So the fact that you use numbers in your native environment seem to affect how you encounter this other environment. So let's summarize. So we don't have very clear patterns of conventions of this kind of conventionalization over generations, but we have some indications. So we see that the environmental biases are attenuated in the Barcelona conditions. So fewer references to horizontal landmarks and number in generation 6 and 1, but it seems that it doesn't really work for the Manhattan condition. And Same goes for the maps, not a very clear pattern, but some indication that something like this is going on. And it might be that had we continued the experiment for more generations, that we would have seen a more clear result here. Great. I think
I'll just wrap up. So these were all the results we showed you. So just if we look at the overall study, what can we actually conclude from it? So what we suggest our data show is that we have some environmental biases that present, or the environment presents affordances for a certain way of conceptualizing the space. So we can talk about environmental biases. And I think our data show this quite strongly in different aspects, that we actually have some impact of whether you're using Barcelona or you're using Manhattan to find your target objects. And we see this as reflected in language. So our analysis focused on the verbal descriptions that people produced, and we really see these differences coming from the different environments. And we also find effects of social transmission. So everything we have as influences from the environment actually seems to get stronger through the social transmission, at least when we look at the verbal descriptions in the real chain. And the idea is that this works because in the description, in the linguistic description itself, there's these keywords that bias your attention to certain features of the environment, which might already be there, but thereby kind of enhances something that is given by the environment. And with this last part, we also find some indication that these conceptualizations get conventionalized, so that it's not just bound to the actual environment you're now in, but that it somehow becomes something that is slightly stronger and has an influence also when going to other environments, so kind of overriding this environmental bias. But keep in mind, the results are a little bit more unclear here because we don't get the very clear double dissociation that we had hoped for. So if we go back to this little drawing, then we do find evidence in our study for a clear interconnectedness between environment influencing conceptualization, which can be expressed in language, which might lead to some form of conventionalization and thereby kind of establish culture. And what is interesting or nice about our study is that we've looked at it in the lab, right? And this is really the strength of virtual reality, that we could, of course, and we should study all this also in real environments, but we really try to narrow it down to certain features that we could control. Now, there's of course always interesting aspects for future research. So right now, Sarah is conducting a replication of this experiment in Iran. So this would be exactly that, trying to see, can we actually see differences or similar patterns when we have different existing cultures and maybe different environments. And another thing that could be very interesting is that if we look at this little drawing we made, it looks a little bit linear, but that's of course not really how we think about it. So especially when you think about humans, human culture, and especially on urban environments, a big important aspect is that we create environments as well. So it is not just something that is given to us and thereby influences how we conceptualize space and use it linguistically, but it is also something that we then modify. So adding this kind of extra loop coming from the culture on how we then amplify these existing differences by modifying the environment in specific ways could be yet another very interesting aspect. And with that, we would like to thank you for listening. And we would also express big thanks to a couple of people who helped us with the study. Jesse Lynch was involved in the graphics, making these really cool 2 different cities. Chris Hayson was helping with the programming a little bit. We had Amelia and Amaya and Astrid doing the data collection. You see, these were a lot of data. And also thanking IMC for seed funding. Thanks. And of course, we are open for questions of any kind.
Excellent, thank you so much. So if you have a question, please just write a question or comment in the chat, we can keep sort of track of it there. I think Mikkel has already written a question.
Okay, maybe I'll actually stop sharing, because then I can access the...
Because my internet is just gone right now, so we need just one.
Maybe it's because I put this in front of...
And Mikkel and Andreas, you're of course welcome to expand on your question if you want. Yeah. But Kristian and Cordula, maybe you can just take questions from here. So I think that's easier than me interrupting all the time.
Nice one.
Yeah, so Mikkel asks, with participants from Aarhus, I suppose Aarhus is a Barcelona city. You expect that to have an influence. You could say that, yeah, luckily, in some sense, all our participants were from Aarhus, or students, at least at Aarhus University. So the differences we do see between our two conditions cannot be a product of that, but whether we would have some kind of main effect in effect in both conditions of that, yeah, that's an interesting question. If they actually already bring in some default strategies, we cannot really answer that, of course, but we are replicating this study now with Sarah in Iran. So maybe we can next year we can come back and tell you about that.
I guess just to add on, I mean, the difficulty with using real environments is, of course, how would we know whether those coming from Aarhus haven't lived in New York for 6 years or whatever, right? So it's really hard to keep track of existing experiences. So that is where we see a big advantage of using virtual reality for these experiments. But of course, it would be great to supplement, or we should supplement it with real data.
Yeah, Andreas. Right, it seems like the Manhattan condition afforded horizontal cues less so than Barcelona did virtual cues. Can we speculate on what enhances or what could have enhanced the horizontal affordances of Manhattan? Do you have any immediate?
Well, I mean, we did try to contrast the two, right? So our manipulation was about how winded the streets are. And so there is something that is very salient about the straight layout of Manhattan. I think this was what we had hoped to see, is just because, yeah, it kind of impacts you to see all straight and have this grid-like structure, just as Kristian was talking about in the linguistic study in the beginning. Then we also contrasted the colors, but I think we just try to.
Yeah, so so I guess the question is, could we have made the horizontal cues even more salient, right? And sure, we had actually a discussion of so how much should we manipulate here? So we did manipulate here two things, right? How winded the streets were and how saturated the color were. And what we could, of course, have added was some kind of texture of the streets. Yes. Yeah. But we also wanted not to manipulate more factors than necessary in order to, because then we wouldn't really know what people were picking up on. But it's an interesting idea to think about. Yeah. So would there be something that would really draw people's attention to the kind of grid-like arrangement of buildings in the Manhattan condition?
We should maybe mention that we tried to control as much as we can. So we basically used the same city, and then for Barcelona moved the walls and the buildings a little bit to create this. So we really, I mean, it's always a balance, right, between making as realistic as you can an environment or as keeping as much controlled. So it's, yeah. Cool. Let's see.
Okay, Nick asks, or he says, to me the research was about cumulative salient feature extraction and discrimination. In line with this view, did the time to target decrease over generations? Oh, I can't remember if there was a main effect. Yeah, I suspect there would be. So we looked at the relation between, of course, the conceptualization and the time to target. But you're right, we should actually go back and look at this. So just to clarify one thing, so so we talk now about environmental bias, and I think that's in some sense a little polemically kind of referring to a huge literature on cognitive biases, right? So there's a lot of studies on cumulative cultural evolution that talk about various kind of cognitive biases, and I guess one thing that we would like to show with this study is that it doesn't need to be all in the head. It might be that there's some initial conditions out there in the environment that actually get enhanced over time, and it doesn't have all to be cognitive biases. So, but you're right. It could definitely we could account for our observations also using this kind of framework of talking about feature extraction and discrimination, because that's definitely the kind of mechanisms that. So, what kind of features are you spontaneously kind of orienting to solving this task?
Yeah.
Yeah, but we'll come back, and we have to look at whether time decrease over the board as a function of generation. That's a good question.
Okay, now we have a question by Erasmus. How do you define affordance in the study? Good question. And you said that social cultural conventions can override environmental bias. Do you see affordances as environmental bias? I guess we do in this particular study, and the affordance would be about kind of how you navigate through it. That is how we use it here. So we didn't define affordance. Affordance is very often about acting within an environment. So in this case, it's this spatial navigation aspect that
we stress. Affordance,
yes, maybe you can say that. Yeah. So which features allow you to navigate and conceptualize the space? It's a good question.
Then
Jonas
someone has a question. Maybe you want to ask it.
Yeah, I just ask it verbally because I think it's easier. As you might know, I ran a very similar experiment, not using urban spaces, but rather using kind of virtual environments where one was a slope, like a mountain slope. So you have like a very strong up-down affordance, and one was a dense forest with a very strong affordance for egocentric left-right kind of directions, because it's very hard to keep track of where you are and so on. And I was also looking into what happens when people switch environments, because I was interested in, do they conventionalize? So this was a dyadic study. It was just a referential problem solving task. And I was very much interested in, do they routinize these different strategies, like based on the egocentric or geocentric frame of reference, using this up-down distinction, or rather using left-right. And it worked out that English speakers, just using their native language, they would use different strategies in these different environments. Now, my prediction was that if this is kind of a conventional thing, and I didn't have any transmission element in it, right? It was just pairs coordinating, that if they switched, they would, if they would go from the slope to the forest, they would have to drop this geocentric strategy, right? Because they could easily, they couldn't easily refer to any egocentric directions in the forest. But vice versa, if you start out in the forest, you can just use left, right also on the mountain slope to solve the task. I didn't explain the task, but it was about object locations as well. And basically what happened is that because in their native language they have both of these strategies available, they still switched. So they would still use the geocentric, even though they started out in the forest. And I think that that has something to do with the fact that if you run a study like this, having participants use basically the systems that they already know from their language or kind of from their cultural background, it's very hard to kind of get them to change their strategy like in this conventional way. If I actually missed that part because I dropped out of the presentation. Was it that you switched the environment in the last trial?
Yeah. No, so for every participant, they would come in, they would do their native condition, you could say, but then in the end, before they left, they would also get a trial. So in that sense, we could see if there would be a higher propensity to switch if you happen to be in the first generation than that if you happen to be in the 6th generation, because maybe what you encounter in the 6th generation is a more kind of full-fledged conceptualization, that would bias you stronger. But of course, yeah, of course, people do not kind of have iterated interactions. They only come in and do these first 2 trials in Barcelona, right? They find the target, and then they find the target again in order to write new instructions, and then they're put into the Manhattan condition, right?
Right. Yeah.
So of course, we probably couldn't expect a very strong result of that manipulation.
So but one thing,
we see something, right? We do see some do see some tendency to switch, especially in earlier generations.
One thing I'm wondering is if the task would involve actually the construction of a convention of talking about space. So what I then did is I did another experiment where they could actually not use language, but they could only send kind of visual symbols to each other that had to represent spatial relations. Have you thought about doing something like this, where it's not actually kind of descriptions that are based on what they already know, so that are readily available, but adding some kind of cost to, because you have to kind of ground the communication system first. It's a bit different in your situation because there's no interaction.
So we had this, that they were drawing these maps, right? But it's not exactly what you suggest, right? But at least it was kind of another way of getting some kind of reflection of the underlying conceptualization. Right?
Why did you not transmit the maps?
That was,
I think it's a design feature. So by just focusing on the verbal description, we can be very clear that it comes from the verbal description, right? So it's kind of, it's just a design feature. If we had given them everything, we wouldn't really know what is it that creates effects. But I agree, it would be great to kind of do something very similar, redo the study, focusing on the drawings and so on. It's, I think it's, our idea really behind this is that we're talking about concepts. I mean, that's at least our claim here, right? So that it's kind of independent of the medium. But in just for cleanliness here, we did decide to just do one route.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so then Niels has a couple of questions. It might be that you would like to elaborate on your questions, Niels.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, it's very cool. Like Nick, I would prefer to talk about adaptation as well. And I've got 2 questions sort of along those lines. So one is on the time depth of your study. So we would assume probably that these sort of modes of, or biases of navigation and also conceptualization of space elements involve some sort of, physical reorganization, elements of plasticity, one way or another. So, and I think we all have this sort of impressionistically, we think that there's a significant individual variation in how fast people adopt to, for instance, if they move to a new country or to a new city, to which extent would they actually take in the sort of local, environmental, and cultural biases or modes, or to which extent would they stick with what they bring with them from their own sort of background. So there's one thing about individual variability, but the other one has to do with the time depth, because plasticity, at least, of course, you can go down to the level of predictive coding and stuff like that, but plasticity in general takes a little bit of time. So, or prefers time, so to speak. So how would this look in a sort of real life situation? I mean, what my point is that in order for you to study the extent to which people actually adapt when they then take their native system to a foreign setting, you would probably have to study greater stretches of time, so processes extending over a longer time. I mean, ideally, I know this is a very impractical sort of remark for an experimental study, but just as a thing to consider. And then the other question would be on then the functionality, if you like, of the environment, native modes versus foreign modes of navigation. So of course, it's super interesting to look at it as like cultural variation, and what actually underlies these blatant sort of cultural variations in the way that people think and talk and move in these physical settings. But would there be another sort of, you didn't say so much about this towards the end, but would there be an additional step of actually testing how well do people navigate, using their native mode on Manhattan, for instance, as opposed to taking someone from a very foreign and then actually looking at the sort of navigational performance, if you like, so if you want to, then connect it even a little further to sort of an evolutionary or biological basis. So
I think these are excellent comments, and I would say we agree on these aspects that what we're probably not really tapping into in this particular study is this real big change in spatial perception, and this is why we choose to talk about attentional mechanisms at this point. But indeed, it would be great to kind of extend the whole time frame to really see how that changes even deeper underlying perceptions and conceptualizations.
Yeah, so I think everyone doing these kind of transmission chain experiments, they of course would agree that we hope with this technique to be able to get some kind of small sneak peek at some mechanisms that also are at stake at the real time scales of historical development and so on and so forth, right? But when we don't get the results that we hope, we often would point to the time scale difference, right? That in the laboratory, of course, we only have people in this particular case, people were in the lab for 15 minutes, right? Then they were out the door again. And of course, what can we hope to see there? Maybe it's actually a miracle that we can hope to see anything at all. But we do see some systematic changes, right, as a product of our manipulation. But we very much agree with you that we probably cannot hope to see something, especially when we start to talk about something like conventionalization or entrenchment processes, right? It kind of lies in the very concept themselves. This is something that happens incrementally over time.
Yeah, but I don't mean it so much as kind of the standard critique of sort of transmission chains in the lab. It's more like, I mean, you have a very concrete sort of prediction here, and you have some results that actually indicate something. That would be a very neat next step to sort of try to be creative about how can we then build some more time depth into it. It could even be lab-based, but just with something that would then, of course, it would be more expensive in time and thus potentially even money for participants or whatever. But something that where you actually would allow the process to roll on so it's much more cumbersome, but something that could be done, I think.
I guess we're just happy we found this first result here, and that could be a good basis. I mean, it would be great to continue and stretch it.
Yeah, and concerning the functionality, right? So we hope to become better Unity programmers, because we had some kind of discussions of whether we could get a kind of more robust measure of like navigation ability by kind of like recording more data from the experiment itself, and that did not really work out for us this time around. But it's I think a very relevant thing, and something that we try to kind of get at it a little more indirectly by looking at the time it takes people to go and actually find the target based on the description, right? And I think as Nick was also suggesting, we need to go a little bit more in detail. It might be that there are actually more information in those data that we can analyze.
If you need help with that, from my experiments, I actually recorded like the looking directions and positions and things like that. And I also used it to actually infer which frame of reference they used, because in my latest study, they are not using language. So I actually have to retrieve from their behavior kind of which coordinate systems that they're using. And I developed some geometric ways of doing that were terrible to develop, but they work. So I can maybe send you my thesis in a few weeks.
We look forward to that.
Yeah.
But thanks, Jonas. Yeah, we'll definitely take you on that.
Oh, and we got another offer. That's super. Thanks. Yes. So I think the rest looks more like comments.
Yeah, now it's time to create a Minecraft-like version of this.
Yes,
Sure, yes.
we agree. This needs to be done.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, some paper. Yes, but I guess doesn't seem there are more questions we can answer. I mean, thanks for the comments. We'll definitely keep them in mind and also see how we can develop this. It would be great to continue, definitely.
Yeah, and we didn't comment so much on the, or we did comment a bit on the use of VR, but of course, yeah, it's an interesting new resource that allow you to do these kind of slightly richer experimental settings, right, where you actually put people into something that starts to look a little bit like an environment, more at least than a 2D maze to navigate, and I think, and still you can actually keep control of the your experimental parameters. So in that sense, we can recommend this for those of you who are kind of concerned about ecological validity, right? That it might be a kind of a solution to at least get a little bit more ecological validity into our labs.
And I think especially for this transfer aspect, being immersed in an environment is probably quite relevant, but of course we don't know without having compared it. But I think that really helps being really inside. So we have some comment from Sarah. Do you want to?
I think she just says.
Ah, there. Thank you.
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
nice.
Yeah, and thank you,
Thanks.
Sarah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah really brought the whole thing to us by coming up with interesting questions about landscapes and urban design and so on. So I think that's really cool collaboration in that sense. All right.
Yeah, but maybe let's call it a day then.
Yes.
And thank you everyone for.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for the talk and this great, fascinating study, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. See you next week.
Yeah. See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.